Get started. Please make sure to mute yourselves if you are not already muted. I see some ground controllers loving on each other in the chat. And oh yeah, just saying where you live if you want to. You don't have to. Palm Springs, yes. Wow, nice geographic spread. Okay. Enough of that. Oh, I'm sorry you guys get to see some of my tabs today. And hopefully I actually muted everything. Okay. Today we are doing an introduction to neuroscience. And this is one where generally people end up feeling like either, okay, I know all this about neuroscience, or holy shit, I have no idea what's going on right now. There's so much happening. Fear not. I have included, it's like a Pixar film. There's something for all experience levels, all knowledge levels, because there are a lot of shitty pieces of clip art and GIFs in this lecture. So even if you know about neuroscience already, you will learn maybe something about pop culture in the meantime, and that's cool, I think. So to begin, why don't we just yell out some factors that have to do with purity, that determines the purity of a substance? Anyone remember this?
Adulterants.
Okay, adulterants. What are adulterants? You can elaborate if you want to.
They can be binders. They can be products of the come from the manufacturing products process, or they could be things that are put in order to like mimic the drug.
Yes, so that's a very good broad definition of adulterant. So an adulterant can be used in a couple different ways. It can describe cutting something with another psychoactive substance that's intended to mimic that substance. That's the more specific definition. But generally something that's adulterated has been cut or stepped on. It's been changed from its original form. So for instance, adulterated pressed pill might contain NMDA and methamphetamine, more common than you think. I met a couple people working like the tail end of Electric Forest who were like, I have no idea where my tent is and I'm going to wait for 16 hours and this Pressy was great. And I'm like, wow, that probably wasn't only MDMA, but I'm not the one to tell you that. So adulterant is a good broad category here. In the interest of time, I'll kind of speed through it. So there are adulterants, right? Things that are cut in. There's diluters or fillers, which are usually inert bulking agents. This can be baking soda or laxatives or lactose or whatever you want. And then there's organic and inorganic impurities. So remember these things, organic impurities are a natural part of the manufacturing process. They're made while you make the drug. It's just like a normal thing that happens. Inorganic impurities are a result of the way that you make the drug, the environment that it's in. They can be shitty precursors or washes. We might talk about precursors and washes later. And inorganic impurities often are like heavy metals and stuff like that, but not always. So some harm reduction organizations include my beloved DanceSafe, $5,000 matching campaign ends in 3 days, and Zendo and Harm Reduction Coalition, the National Harm Reduction Coalition. There are so many. This is just like, if you're completely new to this, these are good ones to start out with, I would say. Now in the chat, because it's a little bit crazy with this many people in here, what do you call something that is a natural byproduct of making a drug? Quick recap. From Mexico. Nice. Natural byproduct of making a drug. Oh man, you guys would hate me in person because I refuse to go to the next slide until people have answered it out loud and everyone's like, fuck you. We just want to sleep. Yes, that's correct. Organic impurity. That's right. Synthesis impurity can also be used. What legal act scrutinized event promoters for providing harm reduction? I'm sure a couple of you feel pretty fired up about this one. The RAVE Act. That's right. What's another name for a diluter? There are a couple. Filler. If you're feeling really inspired, you can say it out loud. A cut. Yeah, you could call it a cut. Like it is cut in. Cut is kind of like a broader. A binder? Yes. Otherwise known as an excipient, right? Lactose. Yeah. A binder, active adulterant. So remember, a binder is an inactive ingredient. It doesn't necessarily, like, these terms are kind of used a little bit loosely generally, but like a binder is usually an inactive ingredient. It's not psychoactive. What specific ailment? There are a couple of these. Do needle exchanges drastically decrease the occurrence of? Yes, HIV, that's right. HIV, AIDS, the same general timeline, right? And overdose. Yeah, overdose is indeed an ailment. In answer to your question, like fentanyl is not used as a diluter because fentanyl is an active ingredient. So what is most likely to happen is that you would have something like something that we just released a report on today, actually, was in Philly. Anyone from Philly in here? Anyone? In Philly, there's a recent rise in prevalence of this particular kind of fake oxy, A215, that contains fentanyl and its precursors, and gabapentin as well, and acetaminophen. So in that case, fentanyl is, instead of putting actual oxy in there, all you need is like 1 milligram of fentanyl, which is even too much for most doses. That's like overdose territory for a lot of people. And then you only have to put in filler and other shitty stuff. So fentanyl is not an example of something that would be used to dilute because you're putting a tiny quantity of it in. Something like baking soda or like baby powder or something. Baby powder would suck. Would be used as a filler or diluter. I don't know if anyone's used baby powder though. That's weird. Right. What is the E word for things that are used to stick pills together and improve their delivery? I said it a minute ago. Oh, we have questions instead.
Binder.
Yes, that's correct. But an excipient was the specific E word, but that's correct. Do gabapentin and fent increase the respiratory depression of one another? Yes, they do. Depressants and opioids compound the respiratory depression of each other, which makes them particularly dangerous to combine. As we'll learn, respiratory depression is the #1 risk from overdose on an opioid, and that can lead to all kinds of other complications because you're not getting enough oxygen in your blood. B12 can be used as a cut as well. Honestly, most things can be cut into other stuff. I've seen like Valium and baby laxatives, like you see like all kinds of stuff in there. Okay, so we got excipients. I'm going too slow again. Skin picking and itching. What is this word? Do you remember what it is? It starts with a P and it's hard to pronounce. Picking. Well, I guess okay, yes, pick, sure. I can't really even say no to that one. It's kind of weird. It's a PR, pruritus. Yes, that's right. That's right. Skin picking and itching. Psoriasis also would make your skin itch probably. But this is pruritus, and this generally comes from 2 categories of drugs. And usually you need higher doses, chronic higher doses to administer this. Stimulants is one of them, that's right. And opiates, opioids. What's the difference between opiate and opioid? You can yell this out if you know it.
Opiates are naturally occurring, and opioids is the full umbrella, including synthetic opioids.
Exactly. Excellent. So opiates come from the opium poppy. They're alkaloids derived from the opium poppy, and opioids are the umbrella category. What is the name of the administration that goes under your tongue?
Topical?
Sublingual.
Sublingual, that's right. I think I heard optical. Optical is in your eyeball. You can actually drop liquid L into your eyeball if you so desire. Have witnessed, does work. Okay, now today I'm extremely excited to share with you the neuroscience segment of this. Like I said, for some of you, even though I've tried to kind of condense a semester's worth of basic neuroscience into 1 hour, it might still be really overwhelming to others of you, especially the many Redditors that we have here. This might be well-tread territory, but it never hurts to go over it again, in my humble opinion. And I made these slides so pretty for your viewing pleasure. So let's begin. This is some neuron stuff right here. Now, this is obviously a dramatized like NCIS, or no, like a house neuron, right? Isn't liquid LSD usually put in an alcohol solution? Wouldn't it hurt to put in your eye? Yeah, you can suspend LSD in a couple of different things, but like you can also drop it in your eye. I've seen people drop alcohol and LSD into their eyes before. Like, I honestly am not sure how that works in terms of pain threshold, but I will do some field research and get back to you, right? So this is what neurons actually look like. It is a very quick succession of electricity, basically. Your brain, big electric. Now, does anyone know how many neurons are in your brain? 2, 5. Pick number 3, my lord. Trillions, billions, with 2 N's. 100 billion. Danita, you are cheating. We got to return our cheating. like more than 12. I have 1 or 2 left. All right, so there are 100 billion neurons in the brain. That's like at least 10 more than I can count to myself. And they're also known as nerve cells. So these are basically cells that communicate with each other really, really fast. That's the whole basis upon which your entire everything exists, is very, very fast, constant, and complicated electrical, chemical signaling. Does that sound scary to you? Raise your hand if this is like, you're like, oh God, this sounds really terrible. Anyone afraid right now? Kind of a little bit. I see a couple people like very vigorously shaking their heads being like, no, I love this. I love brains. Okay, so let's take a look at the neuron, right? I hate that this E is like this. This is not my drawing. I didn't make this. I wouldn't do something like that. So let's take a look at the axon terminal. This is where we're going to be focusing most of our attention, is the axon terminal. This is where the magic happens. Your melon is where the magic happens. You guys all have great melons. I've seen all of them. They look awesome. So the axon terminal receives electricity, receives signal. Signal travels down, axon terminal gets the electricity and does something with it. We'll come into what it does. We're going to build up from the ground up. So we're going to have a ton of little pieces, and they might not make sense on their own, but I promise we will put them together. So we have electricity comes down from these dendrites at one end. Dendrites send all the way down to the axon terminal at the other, okay? So electricity comes in, it is sent, and then it is passed. And we'll go into how that works in a second and why it's relevant. Now, when this electricity is passed, or when it's sent, it goes along the axon. And the axon is basically this long, spindly body. And you can think of it as kind of like the railroad tracks for electricity in your brain, is down the axon. And it's covered by these things called myelin sheaths, which are like little sweaters. So these myelin sheaths act a little bit like the insulator on your computer charger. If you didn't have that insulation, that rubber insulation on your computer charger, the energy and the electricity wouldn't be as contained. So an interesting thing to think about in drug science is about how certain substances like methamphetamine can actually degrade the myelin sheaths on your neurons over time, and that can make them less effective at conducting electricity. It's basically just like your chargers. So think about that. We're going to come back to that later. Now let's kind of change this. Let's look at this as, for reasons that I have never been able to explain, Vladimir Putin. So Putin is going to be our neuron anthropomorphizing thing that we are doing. I am not hearing the feedback, but I will go ahead and mute everybody. Or if you could all just go, I'm not hearing the feedback. So if other people are, let me know. So we want to think of this as a bunch of little people that are stacked on top of each other with their hands tickling the feet of a person stacked on top of them. That's how we want to think about this, right? Now, where the real magic happens here is the neurotransmitters. Now, some of you might be kind of familiar with this. Some of you might be really familiar with this. Bear with me. There's lots more Putin where that came from. So neurotransmitters are these tiny little chemicals that bridge the gap between your tiny little neurons. And these are them right there. These golden orbs are your neurotransmitters. Now, there are lots of different kinds of neurotransmitters, and they do different stuff. The reason that they exist is that, let's say that this is the foot of the neuron that's stacked on top. We got two neurons stacked on top of each other. That's the foot. And there's Putin with his little hands sticking up. We got hands tickling the feet. And in that tickle, that's where the neurotransmitters exist. There are 100 billion of these happening, right? Like that's a lot of hands and toes tickling each other with this little bits of chemicals coming out between them. Now you might be asking, why is this thing that we have? Like, what is the point of this? And I just teased that too early because it's on the next slide. So neurotransmitters kind of act like batons in a relay race. You have two neurons next to each other, and you pass the baton between them. The neurotransmitter is the baton. So you have the foot passing down the electricity to the hands, which are not pictured. I probably should have put hands in here, shouldn't I? And then it continues on or not. Now, this is where things start to get like really interesting. The synapse is this tiny, tiny little space between two neurons, basically, between the foot of one neuron and the fingertips of another neuron. Now, this space allows neurotransmitters to get kind of shocked out of their containers, and then they float down here, do something, and then the electricity continues or not. That's where the magic happens. Kind of the purpose of this is to be able to decide whether or not certain signals keep going, and if so, how strongly. That's why we have this system. It's like a regulatory system. So we have the presynaptic neuron, that's the foot, basically, of the prior neuron. Then you have the synapse, which is the space between two neurons. And then you have the postsynaptic neuron. Now, the way that this energy is transferred is it goes electrical, chemical in the form of a neurotransmitter, and then back to electrical again. It basically acts as a like green light, green light, or maybe red light. That's what's cool about it, is that you can have a lot of influence over what happens based on what goes on in the synapse. If this makes no sense to you, I promise it will. Bear with me, and if you have questions, you can ask them. We go electrical, chemical, electrical. They're basically wires that shoot out and then have to like go through this selection process and be like, are you continuing or not? And then the electricity continues or not. Electrical goes to chemical, goes to electrical. That's how this works. Is anyone wildly overwhelmed? It's okay if you are, you can say something about it. So this is how this looks in practice. You have all these neurotransmitters, these little golden orbs, the chemical messengers. They get popped from their storage bubbles. They float into this tiny little space, and then they do something. Now, this something isn't always shooting a lightning bolt down through the next neuron so something happens. It could be different than that, and we'll find out exactly how. Now, here is what we're looking at right there. There's the axon terminal down at the end, the dendrites of the neighboring neuron, and what we're looking at is kind of the intermingling between them, the place where their little squid tentacles come together and kiss and make fireworks. So let's zoom in on that. Horrifying science diagram. For those of you that don't like this kind of stuff or aren't familiar with this diagram, you have my full permission to like avert your eyes or cross yourself or whatever you need to do. It's okay. This is like a reasonable response to this kind of diagram. So what we want to look at here is what the neurotransmitter does when it's on the postsynaptic neuron. Presynaptic neuron is the one above it, basically. Postsynaptic neuron is the one below it. You have little chemicals, they hit the one below it, and then I showed the lightning going through, but why does that happen? So what we're looking at here is called a receptor. These little hot dog looking motherfuckers are embedded in the postsynaptic neuron. And it's like a baseball game. There are so many of them. So these neurotransmitters will stick themselves into these little hot dogs. And what happens next depends on the kind of neurotransmitter. It depends on what is in that hot dog in particular. Now, this is a practice that's referred to as binding. It basically means that you have this key that gets stuck into a lock, and if it opens the lock, something happens. Electricity continues, the signal percolates. If it doesn't open the lock, nothing happens. And that's important in and of itself, right? So they flow presynaptic to postsynaptic. No, it is presynaptic to postsynaptic. You go presynaptic neuron, neurotransmitters come out, bind at the postsynaptic neuron, and then some other stuff happens that we're not going to get ahead of ourselves right now. I know it's complicated. So you want to think of these like locks in keys. Neurotransmitters are, keys and locks. Neurotransmitters are little keys that fit into little locks, and if they fit properly, and they're supposed to, they'll turn and open the lock and electricity continues on. Now, an early example of why this is relevant might be anxiety, right? So after you felt really, really anxious, your body has a natural anti-anxiety response, releasing a chemical we'll talk about called GABA. And what this basically does is it slows the signaling of the brain. When you're really anxious, there's a lot of signaling, a lot of electricity happening, a lot of stuff going on. To counter that, you're going to have a lowering of the activity. And both of these things involve signaling. If there's a lot of signaling, there's a lot happening. If there's not a lot of signaling, there's not as much happening. That's why this gets important. Looks kind of like this. Presynaptic, bam, something happens. Postsynaptic, let's assume that these are all ones that open the locks, and then electricity continues. That's what that looks like in practice. I'm going to check for any questions. Are all the neurons connected? How do they all talk to each other? It's basically one giant interconnected web. It's really like a really tight mass of sticky little Putin boys that are all licking each other's hands. Like, it's disgusting in there. Have you ever seen a brain? It's fucking nasty. Okay, so why are we talking about this? Like, really, why are we talking about this? I'm so glad that somebody finally asked that. It just makes me feel so good about this. So here's another scary looking science diagram. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. I hope that some of you feel comforted by being able to apply that here. Now we can look at this in terms of, here are a bunch of little locks and a bunch of little keys. If a key fits into a lock, something happens, and it opens the lock, something happens. Electricity goes through, the signal continues. And these are the hot dogs that we previously looked at, but we're gonna conceptualize receptors as being locks and neurotransmitters as being keys. Now, to your brain, and this is just one way that this can happen, to your brain, some drugs look the same as neurotransmitters. So they can do some of the same stuff that your existing neurotransmitters can already do. Now, that's what makes drugs so fascinating on a social perspective, because a lot of people are like, drugs are just some completely alien thing that goes into your brain and does question mark, question mark, question mark. But all drugs are doing is using your existing systems a little bit differently than they usually are functioning. That's all that they do. They don't really add anything. They just take your system and they're like, depending on what it is. Now, there are a lot of ways that they can exert their effects. Oh yeah, here's also binding. I just liked this GIF. Anyone seen this video? I don't remember what this video is called. If you have, you should shout it out in the chat, because literally no one has seen it. It's terrible. So when we're looking at receptors, just like actual locks, only specific things will fit into them. Are you someone in the chat that has seen this? Thank you, Jared, for having seen it. Thank you so much. Oh my God, no one ever has seen it. They're always like, I don't get this. This doesn't make sense. It's not funny. Drinking out of cups. Thank you. So this is what this actually looks like. This is an actual receptor, but that's ugly as hell. So we're going to cover it up and pretend that it doesn't look like that, and pretend that there's a bunch of brass and metal inside of your brain instead. So receptors are particular. They only accept certain things. Now, the way that drugs start to come in here is that a substance that increases the effect of a neurotransmitter, makes it do more of whatever it already is doing in one way or another, is called an agonist. So if you have, I'm sure many of you are familiar with serotonin, a serotonin agonist, that substance will increase the effects of an existing neurotransmitter in some way, shape, or form for some duration with some outcome. And they often kind of mix and match. It's fun, like cocktail night. And an antagonist does the opposite. It's something that can decrease the effects of a neurotransmitter. Now, there are ways that they can do this, and we'll get more into detail with this later. An agonist can continue the signal so that the thing keeps happening. It can release or make more of a neurotransmitter. It can create reuptake inhibition, and there are other things too. And we'll get into what all those are. And then an antagonist can prevent neurotransmitters from binding. They can prevent keys from going into the locks and doing their thing, which can stop a signal from happening, or they can reduce how much of it is made or increase reuptake. And again, we'll talk about reuptake later. So just an example of what this might look like. If something is an antagonist, let's say this is a serotonin antagonist, which is not seen that often, honestly, then it might plug itself up in the receptor, and the neurotransmitter comes along and tries to squeeze itself into it, and it can't, and that's awful, and we're so upset about it. So that's an example of an antagonist in one way that it might work. So the neurotransmitter is like, fuck, I want nothing more than to squeeze myself into this lock and turn it and open and let the signal through. But the antagonist is sitting there looking queenly and won't allow it. Agonist causes more of the neurotransmitter's effect. Antagonist causes less of the neurotransmitter's effect. And right there, you can read a lot of Wikipedia pages. You can be like, that's a glutamate antagonist. I know what glutamate does. Ergo, I know that if I consume a glutamate antagonist, glutamate's effects will be somewhat lessened. They're not going to be as effective. Now let's get into the actual ones. Starting with dopamine. Remember, this key signal is for neurotransmitters. Dopamine is reward and motor control. The two big ones, reward and motor control. Dopamine makes you feel good about doing stuff that is biologically advantageous. And that gets really complicated because what that means to different people can vary greatly from day to day. So more dopamine means you feel more rewarded. For this reason, the class of substances that usually acts on dopamine is stimulants. Stimulants make you feel more rewarded for what it is that you're already doing. Now, this isn't hard and fast, but these are the neurotransmitters that will mostly act on a certain category. Then there's norepinephrine, which is your fight or flight. It's not pronounced Norepinephrir. It's not pronounced Norepinephrir. It's norepinephrine, but you can say Norepinephrir if you want because that's way more fun. So norepinephrine is your fight or flight. It stimulates arousal, it's alertness, and it also is one of the primary neurotransmitters that stimulants act on. So stimulants mainly will act on dopamine and norepinephrine. Serotonin too, but whatever. So stimulant effects, they will increase your central nervous system activity, which makes sense because they're increasing your fight or flight activity and your arousal. And yeah, it's dopamine, norepinephrine. Now I just want to take a second. Hang on, I'm checking questions. The key stands for neurotransmitters. That's right. If it's a key, it's a neurotransmitter. I know there are a lot of icons. Should probably explain them more. I've just taught this so many times now that I'm like, yeah, it's a key. Okay, so real quick, just to get this out of the way, some things that look like they're different, but they're actually the same thing. Norepinephrine is the same as noradrenaline, is the same as noradrenaline without an E on the end. Epinephrine is the same as adrenaline, is the same as adrenaline without an E on the end. MDMA is the same as Molly, is the same as ecstasy. They just have more colloquial referencing. Neuron is the same as a nerve cell, is the same as a neuron. Because why not make things more complicated than they need to be, scientific community? Just like at me. Just getting that out of the way. Okay, this is a new thing that YouTube does, so this is not as clean as usual. That sucks. I wonder what's in my recommended videos. I don't even want to look. Okay, let's take a quick look at a couple different substances in each category. This is about meth, but there's one specific thing I want you guys to see about meth.
The disease of methamphetamine use is addiction. That's the disease. The secondary manifestation of methamphetamine use, people can become Parkinsonian, problems with movement, problems with facial expression, problems with tremor.
The effects of meth changed my whole speech and everything. It gave me like a lisp kind of thing, sort of. It's like it won't come out as clear as it should. I don't know, it's chemicals or something did it.
So the reason I show that one, probably a pretty stigmatizing documentary, don't watch it, it's not worth it. But I want to show that specific scene as an example of how methamphetamine is an example of a substance where chronic high dose usage can cause Parkinson's-like symptoms. Does anyone have an idea, knowing what we just knew about those two neurotransmitters that we just talked about, why that might happen? Which neurotransmitter might get thrown out of whack after chronic high dose use of methamphetamine?
The norepinephrine.
It's not the norepinephrine. That's a good guess.
It's dopamine, I believe.
Yes, it is the dopamine.
I know that all I know about Parkinson's is that there's something that they take to help it, and it's from L-Dopa or something, which is a naturally occurring thing. So, and I'm assuming that's related to dopamine. Yeah,
precursor, I believe. So, the thing about dopamine is that motor control is something that it controls, right? So tremor can be a result of dopamine dysregulation. Doesn't help that all in the meth is cut to shit with IPB. I don't know what IPB is, but I'd be very interested in learning. So please let me know. Now a segment from one of my favorite YouTube channels, Drugs Lab. I know that Drugs Lab has been in some hot water for a couple of things. So I want to have a couple disclaimers real quick. Drugs Lab should not be taken as law. They make mistakes. It's a really good way of seeing people doing drugs firsthand. This is a Dutch government-funded educational YouTube channel where they get high on a bunch of shit and talk about it. And it's the best, but also fact check your information from every source about drugs, this one included, even though it's really fun and I've spent hours and hours watching it. Oh, I didn't know that they were even at risk. Oh yeah, I didn't know the acronym for IPB. Yes, I'm familiar. Okay, let's take a look at some coke.
Jeetje, ik vind het wel spannend.
Ja, maar dat is niet gek.
Alles voor de wetenschap.
Precies.
Christmas is here again.
brandt het?
Ja, hier heel erg brandt het in mijn neus. En het komt heel langzaam, komt het ook in zo'n beetje
It's
in mijn
called
keel.
postnasal drip,
Het voelt raar.
and it sucks.
Zullen we even wachten? En dan als je het voelt, dan zeg je het wel?
Ja.
Ja?
Ja. Ja, ik merk dat mijn keel en mijn gehemelte zijn verdoofd.
Ja.
Ik vind het niet te pruimen.
Je hartslag die is ook flink omhoog gaan.
Ja.
En je temperatuur ook.
Ik voel me wel drukker, ja. Het is heel gek. Ik kan dus wel opeens heel goed door mijn neus ademen. Het voelt een beetje alsof er sneeuw in mijn neus zit. Het voelt ook echt een beetje koel. Ik voel me ook een beetje stout of zo.
En je energielevel, is die hoger dan daarnet?
Nee, niet per se hoger. Ik denk wel wat helderder.
Ja, je zit ook een beetje zo met je mond. Je bent heel scherp. En ja, je ziet het wel.
And you can watch as much Drugs Lab as you want on your own time. Okay, now on to the next neurotransmitter, which is GABA. GABA is basically the one that calms you down after you've been hyped up. This is your natural anti-anxiety response. And GABA is primarily associated with depressants for this reason. If you have more GABA, you're calmer. You are less excited. Your neurons have been inhibited. And this is kind of one that people sometimes have a hard time wrapping their heads around. More GABA means less activity. This is the thing that's like, you can think of it like increasing GABA levels is like throwing pillow fluff into a room. Like you throw more of it in there and it's more fluffy than it was before. So GABA is affiliated with depressants. Now, an increase in GABA slows your system, right? Which means that if you increase your GABA system a lot, or your GABA activity a lot, your system's going to be really slowed down. And this can lead to pretty dangerous side effects like respiratory depression, which we'll come back to later, and also dangerously slowed or stopped heart rate, which is partly why combining depressants with opioids is so incredibly dangerous. Here's a kid on DXM and IHOP, just because I could.
My name is Joel, and I am all lit. I'm in pancakes at the International House.
I'm going to skip to my favorite part. It's 2 seconds later.
Known as, it is known as IHOP because there are pancakes here that you can order for food. If you would like to order some pancakes, they're right here on the menu.
Depressants slow down your overall level of activity. And yes, GABA, that's right. Yes, we'll talk about withdrawals from GABA inhibition, or I'm sorry, GABA agonism. So GABA also is, since it acts on the depressant class, that includes benzodiazepines. So benzos and alcohol and DXM are 3 of the major depressants that are like depressants. Opioids are their own kind of category there, interestingly. They have similar sedating properties, but they're not the same thing. Depressants and opioids are indeed their own unique substances. Now there's serotonin, and then serotonin is involved in so many different things. It's a very scarce neurotransmitter in the brain. Helps you regulate mood and your sleep cycle and your hunger. And increasing serotonin is more pleasurable and sociable behavior, kind of feeling like vibey, I guess. Now, serotonin is predominantly functional on things like psychedelics. Thanks for letting me know about videos being choppy. Yes, DXM is an NMDA antagonist. It's one of those things that has a bunch of different elements inside of it, which is why dissociatives are such a wild class, because a lot of dissociatives act on like multiple different neurotransmitters, including glutamate and GABA in some cases, and opioids in some cases, naturally occurring opioids. So psychedelic effects, generally speaking, psychedelics are not like classical psychedelics that act on serotonin are not wildly stimulating or wildly sedating. In some cases, they can be mildly stimulating or even significantly stimulating, but they're not known for their central nervous system activity. And these are predominantly acted upon by serotonin, or they predominantly act on the serotonin system, I should say. A little bit sleepy today, sorry. This is my favorite diagram because it's so ugly and I can't get rid of it. I just can't bring myself to replace it. I keep finding better ones and I just always come back to this one. It's like my secret love. It's like my forbidden fruit. So LSD mimics serotonin. It emulates the visual of serotonin in the brain so it can stick itself in there and do what serotonin does. But instead of popping out of the hot dog receptor like serotonin usually does and floating away, it wraps itself in the receptor. This is like really uncomfortable. It pulls the receptor over its head like a blanket and just hangs out there for a while. And that's one of the interesting things about LSD. And this is just a sneak peek at a web of associations, like neural associations that are induced under the influence of something like psilocybin. We'll come back to all of this. It's just a teaser. And then there's the other side of the coin with common serotonergic drugs like MDA. For instance, this is MDA. It's kind of like a cousin-ish of MDMA. En we're back with DrugsCo.
Fijn, dat is wel fijn. Zo. Zou ik even kijken of ik wat energieker kan worden?
Maar hier ben je zin in.
Want anders ga ik te veel in mezelf en te veel mellow. Ik denk dat je het goed kan sturen. Ik denk dat we nu een up-tempo nummertje aanzetten en lekker gaan dansen. Even bewegen. Ja, even bewegen. En even een beetje de energie erin.
Hey. Misschien moeten we even op oefenpad.
Ja, op oefenpad. Ja, dit is gelijk een ander gevoel.
Ja?
Ja. Gelijk een ander gevoel.
So that's an example of a different kind of serotonergic substance. So psychedelics, classical hallucinogens, and things like MDMA and MDA act predominantly on serotonin. But you can see that they have really, really different effects. Or I didn't show psychedelics yet, but that's something that I want to talk about later in the course, about how something has like a general class distinction as acting on a certain neurotransmitter, but two substances that act on the same neurotransmitter, generally speaking, have totally different effects. And I'm sure some of you have been in the past, you've been like, well, acid and Molly function on the same thing. They both act on serotonin. So like, it should be dangerous to mix them, right? Or maybe like, will I develop a cross tolerance to them? And the answer is no, actually, it's pretty synergistic, because even though they both act on serotonin, the way that they do it is very distinct, very different. Then moving on to glutamate. Glutamate is a neurotransmitter that facilitates communication between neurons. I say it facilitates communication between brain and body. That's not like a very precise explanation, but the reason I say that is because it helps people remember that glutamate is usually acted on by dissociatives. Dissociatives will kind of interrupt that communication a little bit. They decrease the signaling between brain and brain / brain and body. The thing that made me go in withdrawals for months on end, thanks to Lyrica. Wow, that sucks. I'm sorry. So less glutamate activity means less communication between cells, which also means less pain. So if any of you have ever headbanged on ketamine, you might have ended up in the ER for spraining your chest. That is not an anecdote from someone that I know. That's not whatsoever. So glutamate antagonism, which means decreasing the effects of the neurotransmitter, right? If something is a glutamate antagonist, it decreases the communicative effects of glutamate. So an example of this is dissociatives, right? Dissociatives reduce communication between brain and body, and to varying degrees, not always particularly extreme necessarily. Usually dissociatives will also decrease central nervous system activity, decrease respiration, decrease heart rate somewhat, but that usually is more affected by whether or not a specific dissociative also acts on other neurotransmitters that are more sedating than glutamate. So I know this gets a little bit hairy and complicated for those of you that are new to this game. We'll come back to all of this. This is just a crash course on getting the basics out of the way. Now, let's look at a scary science diagram. There's a specific kind of glutamate receptor. Remember, the receptors are the locks that are opened by the keys. There's a specific kind called the NMDA receptor. And if you were all in my classroom in person, I would have you stand up and say, it's fun to party with NMDA, because everyone thinks that it's MDMA, and it's always really funny to watch people fail at it 6 months later. So the NMDA receptor is a specific kind of glutamate receptor that is like the dissociative receptor. If you go on something's wiki page and it says NMDA receptor antagonist, you can pretty immediately get an idea that it's going to have some kind of dissociative or anesthetic effects, which is really helpful. You know, the point of all of this is to be able to do your own research and like read things. Fair to be always needed. So generally when glutamate is in this receptor, when it binds in this receptor, the neuron fires and glutamate stuff happens. The communication is facilitated and the people cheer and the children cry and everyone's dancing and twirling their ribbons and it's great. That is when glutamate does its thing at this receptor. It binds, the lock goes in, it opens, or the key goes in, it opens the lock, signal continues, voila. That's what glutamate normally does. Okay, so pop quiz. What does glutamate do? What does the glutamate neurotransmitter do? I do this because this is the one that everyone gets the most confused about.
It increases the communication between brain and body.
Yes, okay. Glutamate facilitates communication. It is the great communicator, the orator, one might say. When it binds at the NMDA receptor, what happens? This is a simple answer.
There's a dissociative effect?
Not quite. That's why this is a confusing one. It's understanding that you answered that way. So generally, when glutamate, the actual neurotransmitter, binds at this receptor, it creates a signal. It does its thing. That basically is like the peanut butter to the jelly. Like glutamate is supposed to bind at this receptor. It's supposed to facilitate communication there. Now, on the other hand, if you have something else, that a receptor antagonist, it does the opposite of what usually happens at that receptor. What might that make the receptor do? What might an antagonist do at that receptor? I see blocks the door to glutamate. Yes, it prevents glutamate from binding. It does not allow communication to take place. That's right. So I know this is confusing, which is why we're going over this. So what class of drugs would be NMDA receptor antagonists? What's the class?
Dissociatives.
Dissociatives, exactly. So the point here is we have normally the system functions with glutamate. It's the one that facilitates communication. It's what gets your shit going. That's so pumped. Now, normally glutamate would be like, yes, NMDA receptor, like 5-5. I haven't seen you in like 2 nanoseconds. I'm so happy to be here. Fuck yeah, I'm going to sit myself inside of you and there will be electricity and everything's going to be communicated. And that's great. That's what normally happens at this receptor. If an antagonist rolls up, like ketamine, for instance, it rolls up to the receptor and it's like, what's up? I'm just going to hang out here. And the receptor is like, no, my signaling. And then communication is decreased. And that can mean that your brain is less capable of passing on pain signals or receiving pain signals from other areas in the body. Yes, exactly. I know that's confusing. Just glutamate, communication. Disrupt glutamate, less communication. Specific receptor that you disrupt glutamate at, NMDA receptor. Class of drugs, dissociatives. If you have questions about that, feel free to pop them out or ask them in the chat. I know it's complicated. So let's look at horrifying diagram, but altered to be even worse. So this is if you have a dissociative molecule at play. Ooh, a scary dissociative molecule comes in and it sits itself into the NMDA receptor. It sticks itself in there and it's like, no signaling for you, sir. And then your brain does not communicate with itself or with your body as much as it normally would. Any questions about this? Dissociatives, glutamate antagonists, they reduce the effectiveness of your communication neurotransmitter. That's the real main point here. Dissociatives, glutamate antagonists reduce the effectiveness of glutamate, reduce communication, and it all happens at the specific receptor for a lot of them. That's the point. Okay. Move on. Whoops. All right, so there are two main types of, or there's one main of each of these, inhibitory and excitatory neurotransmitter type. So if a neurotransmitter is inhibitory, it decreases the overall level of system activity. This is a simplified explanation. So inhibitory, it inhibits something, it reduces something. Excitatory, it increases something, it enhances something. Now, excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters, I hate that this stuff is not positioned in the same place on both of these slides. That's horrifying. Am I? So the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in your system is GABA. The main excitatory neurotransmitter is glutamate. So you can kind of think of these as being the opposites one. It's interesting that dissociatives seem to increase the effects of psychedelics when they inhibit communication pathways. Well, there's a lot going on there. You know, I can't go into it right now because I'd get carried away, but there's a lot going on there that's a really great thing to point out. So basically, GABA and glutamate, you can consider to do opposite things. GABA calms your system down. It reduces the amount of talking that your system is doing with itself. Glutamate increases the amount of talking that your system is doing with itself. GABA is over here being silent as the grave, and glutamate's over here being you're on cocaine, if you've ever seen that before. Now, real quick, for some additional drugs lab, because we love it, let's check out ketamine. This is a very large quantity of ketamine. This is not your average recreational bump of ketamine.
Oh. Hoe voelt het?
Brandt een beetje.
Ja?
Ja. Ik heb geen smaak in mijn mond of zo van iets van. Maar ik voel het wel echt in mijn neus zitten nu.
He'll taste it soon enough.
Dan gaan we even wachten.
Ja.
Het kan heel snel gaan, hè?
Ja.
Voel je al iets?
Nee, nog niet.
Nee?
Nee.
Dan gaan we even wachten. We zijn nu 20 minuten verder. En je voelt het al wel lekker, toch?
Ja, mijn zicht, dat is nu een beetje aan het golven. Zo. Wow, dit is vet raar, jongen. Maar het is wel echt vet. Nou, alles rekt uit soms zo. Dit is echt wel echt iets anders. Dit is echt wel iets, je kan het niet met een druk vergelijken wat ik tot nu toe heb geprobeerd. Nee. Dit is echt heel, het is echt, ja. Wow, het is echt vet raar.
Hoe voelt dat?
Ja, raar. Ik voel het niet.
En als ik erin knijp?
Nee, what the fuck? Nee, what the fuck?
Echt niet?
Nee.
Je vraagt je eigenlijk af, is dit nog wel mijn lichaam?
Ja, een beetje, ja.
Daarom kan ketamine dus ook...
You know, I used to watch this video and at the part where he's like, that's why ketamine can be very dangerous because you can't tell when you're being injured. And then I watched that thing happen with someone going to the ER because they sprained their chest while they were headbanging and didn't realize it until later. And now I changed my tune on that one. Hey. Hey. Uh-oh. Oh, it's just another drugs. I'm honestly, I'm just so guilty for these guys. This one's allowed because nitrous is legal.
Terugje te nemen. Rens deed bijvoorbeeld in, uit, in, uit.
Right, nitrous oxide, NOS, whippets, whip wops, if you so desire. Now, the way that she's doing it, breathing in and out of the balloon increases the overall concentration of nitrous in your body for a longer period of time, so you're higher for longer.
Ik haalde heel even adem en daarna tot hij niet meer kon. Sommigen nemen het in 1 keer. Maar ik doe het gewoon net zo lang tot ik niet meer kan. En dan laat ik het ballonnetje vloeperen en dan zien we wel wat er gebeurt. Goed in en uit ademen. Ja, nou, lachen moet je er wel van.
Okay, bad form. She should never do that standing up. If you're going to inhale nitrous like that, you should always be sitting down. Otherwise, you could fish out, which means that you just lose consciousness and drop. I've seen it happen. You have to really be kind of working on it to get to that point where you fish out. But it's like people come in with traumatic injuries at festivals to medical because they fainted on the dance floor from like anesthetizing themselves. And answer the question about GABA, more GABA means calmer. The more of it you have, the calmer you are, basically. Something about borax xenon report. Okay. Then there are naturally occurring opioids in your body, and there are a couple of different kinds of these. We're not going to go into the specifics of what they are, I don't think, during this class, because it's pretty complicated. That would be kind of DrugsCo 2.0. But we have naturally occurring opioids in our bodies. The most common example of this is endorphins. You get a runner's high after you go running. You feel kind of like blissful and peaceful and calm, and it's because of naturally occurring opioid activity in your body. So more activity from endorphins, as an example, in particular, means less pain, more like calm and sedation. It's not always blissful necessarily, as we'll get to with opioids in general. Anything that activates the opioid receptor, well, there are 3 kinds of opioid receptors. So like generally opioids activate opioid receptors, multiple different kinds, and they decrease your respiration, which is your breathing, your heart rate, your blood pressure, and pain signaling in the body, right? Now, the thing about opioid receptors is that if you're calmer, how can it increase anxiety? I'm confused. About GABA, I think that there might be a wire cross there. So GABA is a neurotransmitter where if you have more of it, you're calmer. If you have less of it, you're less calm. So alcohol increases your GABA levels, basically, or increases the activity of GABA in your brain, which makes you feel more calm. It's basically, it responds to anxiety. It's your body's natural answer to anxiety. So it should make you feel less anxious if your body is producing GABA in response to being hyped up. So let's say that your housemate jump scares you and your body's like, fuck, like Norepinephrir, fight or flight, I'm terrified. And then after a minute or two, in response, it would start releasing a little more GABA, because GABA would come in and be like, okay, we're good now. We're going to calm everything down. We've been really hyped up. We're going to get a little less active right now. Does that make sense? You can feel free to ask more questions in the chat. So yeah, if you take something that increases your GABA levels, like benzos, for instance, then that increase in calm will mean that you feel calmer. That's how that works, generally speaking. We'll come back to that. So main kinds of opioid receptors are the mu, the kappa, and the delta opioid receptors. Does anyone know which psychedelic acts on, I think, kappa opioid receptors?
Salvia.
Salvia, that's right. And what other one? There's another one. Starts with an I.
Ibogaine?
Yes, that's right. Ibogaine, exactly. Or iboga, the plant that it comes from. Whoever said, does nicotine increase GABA? That's a good, I should know the answer to this question. The answer is, I believe so. But I'm not positive. Does high dose PCP also have K opioid? Yeah, I also believe so on that one. I'm not sure on the specific opioid receptor, but a lot of dissociatives have opioid activity as well. So this is sedation, right? It's analgesia, it's pain relief, right? Now, the difference between, I want to go into these 2 terms, endogenous and exogenous. If something is an endogenous chemical, it's made inside of your body already. If it's exogenous, it's made outside of your body. So an example of an endogenous opioid would be an endorphin. An exogenous opioid would be heroin. So if you introduce an exogenous chemical into your body, it will interface with your existing endogenous system. Endo, inside, exo, outside. Check this out. Chat is popping. I can't even keep track.
And now, meet Jason.
I hate this video. We're only doing it for one purpose. It's a lot of these are really stigmatizing.
Noon, we met Jason on the street after he scored more drugs from friends.
I just did some heroin and I was sick. And I just did a shot and I'm very, very high. And I feel great and I'm gonna go do what I need to do to make money, you know what I mean? And that's just how it is.
But Jason.
So I will rarely show more than a couple seconds of any video like that because they usually are terrible for a lot of reasons. Most videos depict people that use drugs in awful ways. The reason I show that one is to give you kind of an idea of the like sedation that comes with opioid use a lot of the time. Oftentimes there'll be like speech slurring depending on how high someone is. And this is part of the stigma that comes with opioid use, is that people are generally seen as being like zombified, or they're portrayed as being zombified. Let me kind of stick my crowbar into that. No one deserves to die because they use drugs, and people who use drugs all have value as individuals, no matter what or why they are using substances. Just wanted to say that. Okay, now cannabinoids. Cannabinoids are naturally occurring in your body as well. That's right. You have your own weed system, just like you could argue you have your own heroin system. And that's what's so funny about all of this. So cannabinoids have so many different roles, and they're really interesting in terms of how they work. They do this crazy shit called retroactive signaling. They're like the bouncers of your neurotransmitters. So generally speaking, this is a huge generalization. More cannabinoid activity, higher appetite, less pain. It's not exactly like that by any stretch of the imagination, but for the sake of simplicity. Now we'll come back to these with the specific receptors, the specific locks that the keys fit into. The main two types of cannabinoid receptors, which you do not have to memorize right now, are CB1 and CB2. I just want to introduce this concept that there are multiple different types of receptors. So it gets kind of complicated really, really, really quickly. It's hard to distill this stuff because you have to think about what the different neurotransmitters do, what different ways a drug can be an agonist and increase those effects, or an antagonist and decrease those effects of an existing neurotransmitter system. And then also the ways that these receptors can have their own influence on this whole thing. So it's really fucking complicated. And that's why when someone is like, well, can I mix Lamictal with LSD? I'm like, let me check 150 different things before I tell you. I got to check your enzyme inhibition, and I got to check your different kinds of like calcium channel blockers and whatever. Not in that specific case, but it's complicated is what I'm saying. Part of the point of this is to be like, wow, you have to know a lot of different stuff about what's going on. It's not as simple as drug enter body, drug do this. It's like a massive ripple effect. Here's someone who's baked.
Hello. Again, Facebook. Pay no attention to the mess in the background. That's just stuff that's just back there. So, still bored, but I've come up with an idea to entertain myself and maybe other people. I'm gonna start can't even
Dangers of marijuana. Okay, real quick before we end, endogenous, made inside of the brain, things that are made in your body already, basically. Exogenous, made outside of the body, that can interface with your existing body stuff, basically. Now, really, really quick, I know that I touched on this earlier. We will come back to this concept that different drugs in one categorization can act on neurotransmitters in different ways. So Molly and Coke are both considered to be stimulants, right? Yet Molly dumps serotonin and Coke, I have things for this. Molly really dumps serotonin, whereas Coke is a reuptake inhibitor for serotonin. So even though they both act on serotonin, they do it differently. And this is part of what gives us the distinction between different substances, is they do different shit, even if they're operating in the same system, generally speaking. And that's how we get different effects from substances, right? Here's just a quick breakdown of the different neurotransmitters we talked about today. I blocked off two that we're not going over, and I can't even remember which ones they are, but this is helpful in case you need a general outline of them. I'm going to go 1 minute over. So I specifically only brought up a couple different kinds of receptors, and you might be wondering why. You might be saying, why didn't I talk about like specific serotonin receptors, which I could have. There's the 5-HT2A receptor, the 5-HT2B receptor. They have very different effects. And the reason is that, I mean, those are really relevant. Actually, maybe I should have brought them up. But in the case of glutamate, NMDA receptors are the specific kind of glutamate receptor that are really, really relevant for dissociatives. The specific receptor binding action, the specific lock and the specific key is one of the hallmarks of the dissociative class. Not always, not fully across the board, but it's a major thing to know because you can really use this when you're doing your own research about drugs. You can really look at this stuff. In terms of opioid receptors, each of these 3 receptors has very, very different effects. So for instance, a psychedelic like salvia primarily exerts its psychedelic effects on the opioid receptor, on the kappa opioid receptor. If it were primarily acting on the mu opioid receptor, it'd be different. And that's crazy, you know, like it's good to know about. And then there are 2 distinct cannabinoid receptors. We didn't even talk about that. Not really that relevant. Most receptors as a category of like, here's a thing that exists, are just called like a serotonin receptor, an opioid receptor, a glutamate receptor. But within that, there are specific ones that do specific smaller tasks. It's like within the category of this is a receptor that accepts a neurotransmitter, there are other smaller things that specific kinds of receptors can do. So that's really important to note, again, because if you're looking at a psychedelic that says it's mainly a 5-HT2B receptor agonist, you'll know that it's going to have different effects than classical psychedelics that have a 5-HT2A receptor agonism. So that's all part of like what we're going to get into a little bit later. And the last thing, generally speaking, because I know this is a lot of information for a lot of you, if it acts on GABA, glutamate, or norepinephrine, it either speeds up or slows down body functioning. GABA, glutamate, norepinephrine either speeds up or slows down. Serotonin, dopamine, alters perception and mood. Opioid, pain relieving sedation effect. This is generally speaking. This is a broad overview in case you need to remember quickly what each of these does. Okay, sorry I went a couple of minutes over. Thank you so much, guys. We will indeed talk about synthetic cannabinoids, specifically the JWH 18 and 73 synthetics later. Yeah, if you have any further questions, feel free to stick around. One of my housemates just got home, so unless you have a specific question, I'm not doing generalized office hours right now. But have a wonderful night, you guys.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you.